Welcome to Anatomy and Physiology for Speech and Hearing, Neuroanatomy Part 2. This lecture will be broken down into two videos. The first video will get to continue talking about the gross anatomy of the brain and its related functions. Then we'll move into the cerebrovascular system and end with talking about some general structures within the cerebellum. And then the second video, we'll get to talk about the cranial nerves. So here's a link that specifically is talking about the circle of Willis, which is a component of this, which is this part of the cerebrovascular system. So it is embedded within the lecture, but here for you if you want it. All right, so let's start by talking about the corpus callosum. So to get oriented, this is anterior, this is posterior, dorsal, ventral. This is a mid-sagittal view of the left hemisphere of the brain. So we basically cut away the right hemisphere of the brain. And we're going to be targeting this structure right here, the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum is responsible for communication between hemispheres, interhemisphere communication. And it does that both by sending information and inhibiting information. And I remember the name by thinking of the corpus as the corporal. And the corporal is responsible for sending out this information and telling people what to do, right? And I think of callosum as in colossal, huge. So it's this huge corporal telling each side of the brain what to do and what not to do. And so that's simply how I remember it. So corpus callosum, and it is a very, very huge white myelinated fiber tract between the two hemispheres of the brain. So, and remember, the white myelinated tracts are just axons that have that cholesterol wrapped around it. And in the central nervous system, you'll remember the oligodendrocytes make the myelin that surrounds the axons. Right? So any myelin within the central nervous system is oligodendrocytes. Any myelin in the peripheral nervous system is produced by the Schwann cells. Right, so that was just a little overview. Now, the corpus callosum has some general anatomy of its own. To begin, we have the rostrum, the genu, the trunk, and the splenium. You're not responsible for the separate functions of each, however, you do need to know the relative location of each part of the corpus callosum. So, I remember the genu, because the name of the genu, because it's closest to the frontal lobe, which is responsible for intellect and personality. And I think, well, my personality is very genuine, so it's closest to the genu of my corpus callosum. Now, their functions are not related. However, it does help me remember the name. So genu, and then trunk or body is the largest part, and then splenium is the most posterior aspect. So I think I have a spleen, and if I were set up anatomically like a cat or a dog, that would be the most posterior or caudal aspect. So there's my splenium. All right, now we get to move on and talk about the limbic system. The limbic system, it's Latin for border or edge, but it's largely responsible for our emotionality, which is actually a part of our older brain. So the ability to respond to stimulation or the external environment at an emotional level is really important for survival and for reproduction, which is why you're able to evolve, right? If you can't reproduce, if you can't survive, you can't reproduce. And even if you survive and you can't reproduce, you can't send your genes on to the next generation. So this limbic system is super important in terms of being able to do that, of surviving in the gene pool. So the limbic system is not one structure. It's an aggregation of a number of structures that work together to produce and allow you to respond to these the external world in a certain way. So, and when we talk about the limbic system, we don't want to just target emotionality, although it is super important. It also plays a large role in memory and in learning. So we have, it also the olfactory sense is also a part of this, which I don't know if you guys remember when we talked about the rhinencephalon and how it's so interesting that the rhinencephalon is a part of that proencephalon, right? You remember how, and that's the new brain, but the limbic system is part of the old brain. I mean, it's embedded in the cerebrum, but it's a part of that older part of our brain. But then we have the olfactory sense, so it's just interesting to me why it's located there. If anybody can figure out why, or let me know, because I think it's just fascinating. So the limbic system helps modulate emotion, behavior, olfaction, and long-term memory. And it does that via these groups of structures. So let's go into those groups of structures and break down each structure's function and location. So to begin, we'll talk about the cingulate gyrus, which is this guy right up here. Okay, so this is a picture of all of the structures listed in green here. And I have gray over here to indicate that we're talking about the cingulate gyrus. Now the cingulate gyrus is actually right here, and it's a C-shaped structure. So that's how I remember the C in cingulate gyrus, and because it's C-shaped. And so it's on top of the limbic system, and I think in order to perform any type of executive functioning, which is planning and organization, you have to be able to attend to it. So when you have a patient that is having a difficult time attending, whether they're a child that has some attentional deficit problems or an adult that might have a stroke and it just isn't unable to attend for whatever reason, whether that be a lesion that's connected to the cingulate gyrus or some sort of frontal lobe cerebral cortex problem. Anyway, I think that attention has to be at the top of the rung in terms of what's going on. The patient's not going to learn. The patient's not going to benefit from therapy if they're not attending to therapy. And so I think that's at the top of the list of orders that needs to happen. And so anatomically, the cingulate gyrus is at the top or the most superior aspect of the limbic system. So it just helps me remember attention is super important. That's at the top of the list in term therapeutically and for you as a student. So that's the cingulate gyrus is at the very top. Now, the anatomical position of the cingulate gyrus and its function aren't really related that way, but it helps me remember it. And it's also important for heart rate and blood pressure, so those autonomic nervous system functioning. So I have this little scenario in my mind where I think, oh, okay, now I can't, if I'm not attending to something like, I don't know, maybe something I'm super excited about, say that you love to ride roller coasters. If you're not attending to the fact that there's roller coasters, your heart rate and your blood pressure can increase in response to your enthusiasm for that, right? So those all go together. That's just how I remember it. Now, we're going to move into talking about the fornix, mammillary bodies, hippocampus, and amygdala. So let's just start from the top. So we're going to talk about the fornix first. So if you look at this picture here, it's just a relay system. So it's white neurofibers, remember, myelinated axons that travel from the mammillary bodies to the hippocampus. Okay, so just think of a phone cord traveling from here to here. That's all it is. And I don't have a fancy way or a good way to remember fornix. I just something that I've had to memorize. But if you guys come up with one, put it under tips. All right, so let's talk about the mammillary bodies. Mammillary, again, are just olfactory relay, similar to the fornix. Okay, so they're part of that rhinencephalon. And it sends information to the hippocampus. Okay, and the hippocampus is responsible for integrating short-term memories into long-term memory. So, and I remember this whole system, the mammillary bodies, the fornix, and the hippocampus all together. When I think of, I don't know, there's certain smells that remind me of things, and I'm sure you guys can all think of some. So, cinnamon reminds me of the holidays, or certain snickerdoodle cookies remind me of my grandmother. So different smells remind you of different things. So long-term memory. And so I just remember that the mammillary bodies, fornix, and hippocampus are all related. Okay, in that way. So smell and long-term memory. It's also important for other integration of long-term memory as well. So I remember the long-term memory part this way. I know that elephants on the savannah have excellent long-term memory. because I watch the Animal Planet a lot. And so I think, well, if elephants have excellent long-term memories, hippos do too. Now, I don't know if hippos have excellent long-term memories, but it does help me remember that the hippocampus is responsible for integration of these long-term memories. And so hippo actually means horse. Um, and so I guess it's horse-shaped anatomically. I actually don't see that, but if that helps you remember too. All right, and now we're going to move to the amygdala. Amygdala means little almond, and so this guy right here. So it's a little almond shaped. It is really responsible for emotional learning. So it's really the main player in learning. So the hippocampus integrates information from short to long term, but it needs to get there somehow, and it does that through the amygdala. And so it's just that's the primary role. It's also important for social functioning. So there are studies that say the larger the amygdala, the larger the social network of the creature. So so just think, and it's also important for the social aspects in terms of mating. Okay, so um, so it plays a role in learning, reward, fear, and socially significant behaviors as well. So I didn't have learning here, but I'm going to write it down for you guys. All right, so here's the limbic system without the cingulate gyrus resected from the brain. It's just a bigger picture of the one that I had listed for you guys on that last slide. So just so you guys can see it. So remember, olfactory relay, integration of long-term memory here at the level of the hippocampus, and then we have the amygdala here and here. So remember, learning, mating, socially significant behaviors in terms of relating with other people or other creatures, if you're talking about something other than a human. All right, now we get to move into, okay, so we can, you can actually see the mammillary bodies from the inferior aspect of the brain. So here they are, right here and right here. So they actually look like mammary glands, and mammals are the only animals that breastfeed. So so I think they look very similar to mammary glands if you saw them. So, and actually, I'm going to hopefully post a video of a dissection of a sheep brain that I've done in other classes, and then you guys can see the mammillary bodies, and it'll help make sense. Help you make sense of that structure. All right, so we have the pituitary gland, and you guys remember the sella turcica from the cranial skeleton. So the pituitary gland sits really snug right in there, and then there's a structure that relays information or helps connect the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus, and that's the infundibulum, which is right here. And then we have the optic nerve and the optic chiasm. So here's a picture of the optic nerve here and here, and this is actually cut away from the eye. So it would actually travel up here, and then the eye would be here. Okay, and then the chiasm is a point of decussation. So half of the information from this eye and half of the information from this eye is going to cross over to the other side of the brain via the optic chiasm. All right, and so here we already talked about the mammillary bodies. Okay. Now we're going to talk about myelinated fibers. Remember, those are just axons that are covered with that cholesterol sheath formed by oligodendrocytes. So we have three different types. We have projection, association, and commissural fibers. So projection are the longest ones. And so you want to think if you are speaking to a group, you need to project your voice. It needs to go very far. So projection fibers need to go very far as well. So they connect portions of the cortex to distant locations at the level of the brain and the spinal cord. So here's a picture of it. This is actually called the corona radiata, and it's a part of that primary motor strip. And so, and you actually don't need to know this. You will know it when you get to neuro. Your neuro class. You'll get to learn more about this stuff. But so here's would be the level of the cerebral cortex, and then there's this corona radiata. These projection fibers travel all the way down the spinal cord. Okay, and then innervate different nerves within the body. Okay. The next one are association fibers, and association fibers provide communication between regions within the same hemisphere. So an example would be the arcuate fasciculus between Broca's and Wernicke's. So they can be short or long. That's a longer one. And then we have commissural fibers. So the corpus callosum is a great example, and that runs from one hemisphere to the other hemisphere. All right, now we get to talk about the basal ganglia. So just like the limbic system, the basal ganglia are an aggregation of structures within the body. Not within the body, within the brain, I apologize. And they provide control of background movement and initiation of motor movement patterns. Additionally, they're also responsible for higher order voluntary motor control. So being able to decide to step up on a box or pick up a fork, so forth. And they make sure that so background movement is interesting. You need to have your muscles need to be flexed a little bit at all times to be able to provide sort of a foothold to push against. Like if all your muscles are flaccid all the time, you wouldn't have other muscles to push against or push into. So you need some background contraction, and the basal ganglia maintains that posture essentially. And then the initiation of motor movement is super important. So I'm sure you guys are all familiar with Parkinson's. So if we don't, and so let's skip down to the putamen. So the basal ganglia has putamen. The basal ganglia has a structure called the putamen, and it's dopamine dependent. So if you think back to the anatomy of the brainstem, you'll remember that there's a structure in there, and its name is escaping me. Oh my goodness. Substantia nigra, and it forms dopamine. Thanks for your patience. And so it produces dopamine, and if that structure is damaged in any way, then you can't get dopamine up to the putamen, and you get Parkinson's-like symptoms because you can't. And that what's happening is that patient is not able to initiate motor movement. Once they're moving, they continue moving, but initiating a new motor movement can't occur. So a lot of times you'll see patients with Parkinson's that are moving all the time, kind of extra motor movements. That's not because of their pathology. That's because of the medication that they're taking. If they weren't taking medication, they wouldn't be able to move at all. They wouldn't be able to initiate any of that voluntary motor control. So let's talk about so here's a picture. So this is a coronal view of the brain. Here's the putamen. So here's another picture of it. This here is a horizontal view of the brain. All right, so then we have the caudate nucleus. That's responsible for learning motor movements, voluntary motor movements. So learning how to dance, for example, is one. So here's the caudate nucleus here and here. So here is your lateral ventricles. Okay, so it's just to help get you guys oriented. Longitudinal fissures right here. All right, and then we have our globus pallidus, or pale globe. That's responsible for planning and inhibition of movement. So inhibiting movement is just as important as producing it. So we don't want a lot of extra motor movement as well. All right, now we get to talk about the thalamus and the hypothalamus. So we have covered that in terms of the diencephalon, but this is a good review. So remember that the thalamus, and we do have a right and left thalamus. There's lobes of the thalamus, so right and left here. So this is a nice little picture depicting that. It's that grand central station, or that bus station, that relays sensory information from one side of the cerebral cortex to the other. Okay, and then we have the hypothalamus, which is right below it. Hypo is below. It provides an organizational structure for the limbic system. Regulates reproductive behavior. So I did talk to you a little bit about luteinizing hormone. but it's a hormone that tells you when to ovulate. So there's a lot of androgynous hormones, which are sex hormones, that are part of this, that the hypothalamus and then the pituitary gland and so forth. So hunger, satiation, digestive processes, water balance, and body temperature, those are all endocrine related functions. All right, now we get to move to the cerebrovascular system. So I'm just going to give you an overview of arteries and veins, and then we're just going to target arteries in terms of the cerebrovascular system. All right, so an artery carries blood away from the heart. It's typically oxygenated, whereas veins carry blood to the heart and are typically deoxygenated. Now, I have typically there because oftentimes when we look at pictures of arteries and veins, we think blue means vein and red means artery. Now, that's not always true. So if you look at the anatomy of the heart, and you don't have to learn the anatomy of the heart, I just want you to understand that that's not always the case. So remember, arteries carry blood away from the heart. So here is an artery carrying blood away from the heart, but it is blue. Okay, and this is an artery that's actually is carrying deoxygenated blood to the lungs to be oxygenated. Then we have a vein right here and right here carrying blood back to the heart, because remember, that's the definition of a vein, carrying blood to the heart that's been oxygenated. So it's been oxygenated at the level of the lung, then it's going to be sent back into the heart, to be pumped out into the aorta, and then to the rest of the body. Okay, so those are the outliers in terms of the blue to red definition. So don't target the blue to red definition when you're looking at the vascular system. Most of the time you're right. Red is an artery and veins are, and red is an artery, blue are veins. But that's not always true when you look at the anatomy of the heart. So let's go ahead and, so veins are one-way valves, and they have, basically what happens is so if we're going to look at this vein, when your muscles contract or you constrict this smooth muscle around the vein, you push blood up, okay? And then there's these one-way valves that don't allow the blood to swish back. So you're working against gravity as you're pushing the blood back up to the heart. Okay, these one-way valves. So if you ever get varicose veins or know somebody that does, basically this vein has become so dilated that the valve isn't wide enough to keep the blood from pulling back down. So that valve can't work anymore because that valve covers are no longer touching each other. So that's why you get varicose veins. Now arteries are different. They're not set up in this one-way valve system. They use a lot of muscular control to constrict and dilate to shunt the blood where you need it to go. Okay, so there's a lot more smooth muscle in an artery than there is in a vein. All right, so now we get to talk about the cerebrovascular system. So let's begin by talking about the aortic arch. So let's go back up to the heart really quick. This is the aortic arch here. So it's leaving the heart. It's the first artery leaving the heart. Okay, and it's the main artery. Okay, so here's another picture of it. So this is where the heart would be, right here. Okay. Let's see if I can find us a heart. I'll draw one. So here's the heart. So here's where your heart would be, right here, okay? And then we have the ascending aorta, the arch of the aorta, and the descending aorta. We're really interested in talking about these structures right here. Okay, so we have, so at the level of the aortic arch, we have the left common carotid and the left internal and external carotid. Okay, so here's the left common carotid that's going to branch off into the internal and the external. Okay, and then on the other side of I think we should switch these. Okay, so this is left and this is right in this picture. Okay, so just so you don't get disoriented, because when you're looking at it, that's opposite, right? So we have the, okay, so essentially the anatomy from this point on up is going to be the same. The only difference is what we're going to talk about right now. So we have the brachiocephalic artery on the right side that branches off into the right subclavian and the right common carotid. Okay, you'll see on the left side that we don't have a brachiocephalic artery. Now let me talk to you about why I think we have a brachiocephalic artery on the right side. So if you think, where is your heart in terms of anatomically proportionately in the thoracic cavity? Is it on the right side or the left side? So it's on the left side, right? So I think that we need this extra little piece of artery to get the blood over to the right side of the body, because the heart is closer to the left side of the body. So my theory is that we need this extra little extension of artery, okay? And it helps me remember. Now, I don't know if that's true. That's just my thinking. Okay, so then we have the brachiocephalic artery breaking off into the right subclavian artery. So the right subclavian actually travels underneath the clavicle. So it's an artery that travels underneath under the clavicle, okay? And then we have the right common carotid, and many of us have heard of the carotid artery. Okay, so it's common carotid, and both common carotids are going to break off into internal and external carotid arteries. Okay, so just the only difference really is the brachiocephalic artery, or it's also called the brachiocephalic trunk. Okay, so on the left side, we still have the left subclavian and the left common carotid. So the only thing, don't let it get you all, nervous or flabbergasted, is the only difference really between the anatomy of the right and left side of the cerebrovascular system is this brachiocephalic trunk or brachiocephalic artery coming off of the arch of the aorta. Okay. Otherwise, we have internal and external carotid, or common carotids that break off into the internal and external, and they both have subclavian arteries, right and left. Okay, so here's another picture of that. So here is our aortic arch. Here's the brachiocephalic artery. Here's the subclavian traveling underneath the clavicle, and then the common carotid. Okay. Oh, and then we have our vertebral, which isn't shown right there. So vertebral artery here. Remember, the vertebral artery travels up through that interventricular, travels off of the lateral aspect of the cervical spine, so the transverse foramen. All right, so we have our left and right common carotids as well, our vertebrals, and then our subclavian. So I really encourage you to draw out pictures. It will help so much if you can just draw out the picture of this cerebrovascular system. Right, so here's another picture of it. So here is our common carotid, here, vertebral, and then you'll see that the common carotids branch off into the internal, follow it up, and the external carotid artery. Now the internal are going to be the primary artery that we're interested in, because it helps form the circle of Willis, which is right here. All right, so here is the circle of Willis. So basically we're going to talk about this structure right here that's circled. And it's actually right here. So you can stop and watch the video just to help get you oriented a little bit. But the vascular system kind of travels up this way, and then here's the circle of Willis next to that optic chiasm. And then, so here's our little buddy, the circle of Willis, and I encourage you to draw this picture. So here's the vertebral arteries coming together. So remember, the vertebral arteries travel up through the cervical spine via the transverse foramen. So what happens is the vertebral arteries come together and form the basilar artery. So I think of it as the base, which is right here. Okay, so we have the vertebral artery. So here's the aortic arch. Okay, this is the brachiocephalic. This would then be subclavian here. It would travel down, subclavian, subclavian. This is vertebral traveling up, vertebral traveling up. Okay, so vertebral traveling up forms the basilar artery, which is right here, also right here. So this is it cut off. Okay, so vertebral, vertebral. Go ahead and try to draw this out while I'm talking. I think it'll help make sense of the whole thing. So basilar artery here. Okay, then we have common carotid branching off to external and internal carotid. Okay, so the internal carotid is going to come form the circle of Willis. Okay, so this would be the internal carotid here, internal carotid here. Okay, all right, so are we comfortable with how we got to the circle of Willis? So vertebral arteries and the internal carotids send the blood up to the brain. Vertebral arteries and common carotids, or common, sorry, not common, I apologize, internal carotid. Get blood to the brain, okay? So here's another picture of it. So this is just the circle of Willis. So here are the vertebral arteries, the posterior aspect of the circle of Willis, okay? And so here's the vertebral. They go up to form the basilar artery, okay? I don't need you to get into the cerebellar communicating arteries or anything like that. We're just going to break it down into these. You're responsible for these arteries, okay? In addition to the ones we talked about above. So they're on your guys' terms to know. So basilar artery here. Then we have, why don't we just go through this together? So let's start from the bottom. So we have our vertebral arteries, basilar artery. So I guess I did want you to do the superior cerebellar arteries. Okay, which are these guys right here and right here. Then we have our posterior communicating arteries, which are right here and right here. Okay, and you'll see that the posterior communicating artery branches off to become, okay, so here's the posterior cerebellar, and then the posterior communicating, which is right here and right here. Now there are two posterior communicating and only one anterior communicating, which is right here. So think the posterior communicating are much larger, and there's two of them. And then we have one anterior communicating, okay? So we have posterior cerebral, and then we have anterior cerebral up here, okay? And then bringing some of that blood, so we have blood coming up this way, and then we have blood that's going to come in this way from our internal carotids, okay? So here's our internal carotid. And our internal carotid is going to branch off into either the anterior cerebral or the posterior communicating or the middle cerebral. So we have our anterior cerebral, which is right here, middle cerebral, and posterior cerebral. And then we have our communicating arteries, which are posterior communicating and our anterior communicating. So we have three communicating arteries. Two are posterior, one is anterior. Okay. And then we have our anterior, middle, and posterior cerebral arteries, and then our superior cerebellar is what I wanted you guys to know about. Okay, so draw this picture out, and it will make a lot more sense for you guys. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about what can go wrong. So if you work with adults or with neonates, they're really at risk of having strokes. So we're going to talk about blood clots, floating blood clots, and aneurysms. So a thrombosis is really a blood clot. It's any foreign body that's obstructing a blood vessel. So, and that can cause cell death, right? So if we're not getting blood to where it needs to go, it's not getting the nutrients and oxygen it needs, then you can have damage to that tissue. An example of that is a thrombosis. The next one is a floating blood clot. We call that an embolism. So it's when a blood clot travels from one part of the vascular system to another. And then we have aneurysm, which is a dilation or ballooning of a weak blood vessel. And that's you're at risk of that aneurysm exploding and blood getting all over the neural tissue, which is super bad, like we talked about. So then you can have a hemorrhagic stroke because of it. All right, so now we're going to talk about anatomy of the spinal cord. So this is the posterior aspect. Here's the spinous process. Here's the anterior aspect. And then in here, we're going to talk about the spinal cord right here. So this is the corpus of your vertebra. And then tucked away, here's our spinal cord. Okay. And here are our spinal nerves. All right, so this is a horizontal view of the spinal cord. So this is posterior, this is anterior, and there are several gross anatomy structures that I want you to be aware of. So we're going to talk about the posterior gray column, which is right here. So gray matter are those neural cell bodies and dendrites, whereas the white matter are myelinated axons in the spinal cord. Okay, so here's aggregations of neural cell bodies. So we have the posterior gray column here, anterior gray column. Then we have the posterior median sulcus, anterior median fissure. So remember the longitudinal fissure of the brain? Remember, a fissure is just a really big sulcus, and the anterior aspect has a very large sulcus, which is a fissure. Okay, and then we have the posterior intermediate sulcus, and then the central canal. And the central canal is where that cerebrospinal fluid flows through. All right, so now we get to talk a little bit more about anatomy of the spinal cord. So we have so this is posterior, this is anterior. This is a spinal nerve over here. So we have the dorsal root, and we have the ventral root. And information always travels like this. Posterior to anterior. Okay, so sensory information coming in, motor information traveling out. Okay, and we have a spinal nerve when we have both afferent and efferent information. Okay, so when we have both that sensory and motor pathway together, then it's a nerve. Otherwise, it's a root. So dorsal and ventral. So I remember, so sensory information is dorsal. So if I got hit in my back, that's sensory information coming in, I would respond anteriorly with my hands. So that's just how I remember dorsal and ventral, so sensory and motor. So motor is and the dorsal aspect, whereas, motor is ventral and sensory is dorsal. And then we have our interneurons here, and remember, most of our central nervous system is made up of these interneurons. Okay, and then we have our motor neuron, which is here, and then our afferent or sensory neuron here. Now, there's some integration of sensory information that happens at the dorsal root ganglion. So remember that a ganglion is an aggregation of neural cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so you'll see a little bulge here. All right, so now we get to talk a little bit more about the cerebellum. So it coordinates motor commands and integrates that with sensory input. So that's your ability to step up a stair and feel and know where it is and do it fluidly. All right, so we're going to talk about the lobes of the cerebellum, and then we're going to talk about peduncles of the cerebellum on the next slide. So we have three primary lobes of the cerebellum. So here's the brainstem. So this is anterior, this is posterior, superior, inferior. All of this is your cerebellum. We have three lobes. We have the anterior or superior lobe. We have the posterior lobe, and then the flocculonodular lobe. Okay. We also have another name for it called the anterior lobe is also called the spinal cerebellum. the cerebrocerebellum, and then the vestibulocerebellum. So you're responsible for all of those veins. So the spinal cerebellum is largely in control of posture. Um, so maintaining that muscle tone is important for, remember that background tonicity of the muscle. That helps regulate that. It works in conjunction with the basal ganglia. All of the motor control stuff works together. And then we have this blue lobe here, the cerebrocerebellum, is responsible for that fine motor control, planning and modulating voluntary activity, and responsible also for stores of procedural memory. So maybe you have a whole schema for when you're washing your hair or brushing your teeth, and you're not thinking about that consciously. You're just going through the motor plan. Or say you're used to driving to school the same way every day, and you've decided then to maybe go off route and grab a coffee or something, and you end up at school instead of at the coffee shop. That's part of that procedural learning in that cerebrocerebellum part. So kind of interesting. I know that's happened to you guys. It's happened to me. So the last one is our vestibulocerebellum, and that is responsible for balance or maintenance of balance, and also hand-eye coordination, so control of eye movements too. All right, so now we get to talk about the cerebellar peduncle. Peduncle means little foot, like pedal on a bicycle. Ped means foot, so peduncle is a little foot. And we have three of them to talk about. We have the superior, middle, and inferior, and they all relay information differently. So let's begin by talking about the two. Start by talking about the middle and inferior, the two lower peduncles. Okay, they both are responsible for getting information into the cerebellum, whereas the superior peduncle is responsible for sending information out of the cerebellum. Okay, so the inferior cerebellar peduncle gets information from the spinal tract to the cerebellum. Okay, so it's inferior. Think the spinal cord is quite low, and so we need to get information into the cerebellum from the spinal tract. So we're going to do that via the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Then we have the middle cerebellar peduncle, which is of course higher than the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and we're going to get information from nuclei in the pons and cerebellum, from the nuclei in the pons to the cerebellum, which is actually coming from the cerebrum, right? So you'll see that tract here. All right, and then lastly, we get to talk about the superior cerebellum. Now that we have the information in, we're going to integrate that, okay, and then send that out either to nuclei in the brainstem or to the thalamus. Okay. All right. Well, congratulations to you guys. We just finished the first part of Lecture 2 in neuroanatomy. In the next video, we get to talk about anatomy of the brainstem, specifically our cranial nerves.